Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, March 28th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. It is going to be a very warm day in Riverside, with a high reaching 91.6 degrees and a low of 68.3. Please make sure to keep cool and stay hydrated if you are out and about in that heat today. On the program, we are examining a concerning report regarding how a shortage of interceptors exposed a major American military base to potential threats from Iran. We are also breaking down what millions of people with student loans need to know as the current landscape for repayment plans shifts significantly. We will cover those topics along with several other stories making news today. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We begin this morning with a major development in the month-old war between the U.S.-Israeli coalition and Iran. Yesterday, Iranian forces struck a key American airbase in Saudi Arabia, marking the single worst day for U.S. troops since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th. Ethan has been following this story closely. Ethan, walk us through what happened at Prince Sultan Air Base.
So Prince Sultan Air Base sits about 60 miles south of Riyadh, and it's one of the most heavily defended installations in the region. Yesterday, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps hit it with what military analysts call a saturation attack. According to NPR and the Washington Post, that means Iran launched a coordinated wave of at least one heavy ballistic missile, along with a swarm of cheap, one-way Shahed attack drones. The goal was to throw so much at the base's defenses that something would inevitably slip through. And that's exactly what happened.
And Saudi Arabia has Patriot batteries in the area. Why didn't those stop this?
That's the key question this morning. CBS News and the Wall Street Journal both report that Saudi-operated Patriots actually did intercept other threats aimed at Riyadh itself on the same day. But the volume of fire directed specifically at the airbase was simply too much. There's a growing shortage of American missile interceptors, and commanders didn't have enough to stop everything. At least one missile got through and hit a building where U.S. personnel were housed, and others struck the flight line where aircraft were parked.
So how bad are the casualties?
AP, NPR, and CBS News all confirm at least 12 U.S. service members were wounded. 2 of them are in critical condition with life-threatening injuries right now. The other 10 are listed as seriously injured and need intensive medical care. When you step back and look at the full 30 days of this conflict, the total stands at 13 Americans killed and more than 300 injured. Yesterday was the worst single incident by far.
Beyond the people hurt, there were significant aircraft losses too. What do we know about that?
This is where the strategic damage really stacks up. The Washington Post and NPR cite satellite imagery confirming that at least 1 kilo Coulomb 135 Stratotanker was destroyed by fire on the ground. 3 other refueling planes, including newer KC-46 Pegasus tankers, were damaged to varying degrees. And perhaps most concerning, an E-3 Sentry AWACS plane was hit while sitting on the apron. That's the aircraft that manages aerial battles across the entire region, so losing access to even one of those is a serious blow.
Why would Iran go after tankers and surveillance planes specifically?
Because those are the aircraft that make the whole air campaign work. Military analysis provided to The Hindu and the Wall Street Journal describes Prince Sultan as a primary combatant node for Operation Epic Fury, not just a defensive base. Planet Labs' satellite imagery from February showed a massive buildup there, including 43 aircraft. The tankers are what allow American and Israeli fighters to reach deep inside Iran. Without them, the coalition's strike range shrinks dramatically. Tehran has officially called the base a launch pad for offensive operations, and that was their stated justification for hitting it.
You mentioned an interceptor shortage. How serious is that problem right now?
It's being called a full-blown crisis, and the math is really alarming. Fox News and the Payne Institute report that in just 30 days, the U.S. has burned through nearly 40% of its entire THAAD inventory and more than 400 Patriot interceptors. American factories produce roughly 600 to 650 Patriot interceptors per year, but the rate of use in this war far outpaces that. At current burn rates, stockpiles could be exhausted by April. Commanders are now doing what they call selective targeting, which essentially means choosing which bases and assets get defended and which ones don't.
That's a stark picture. What is the administration saying about all of this?
Secretary of State Marco Rubio was at a G7 meeting in France and struck a pretty confident tone. He said, quote, "The operation is ahead of schedule," end quote. He claimed the U.S. has already destroyed roughly 1/3 of Iran's total missile stockpile and 2/3 of its production facilities. So the argument from the administration is that even though Iran can still land painful blows like yesterday's attack, its overall capacity to wage war is shrinking fast.
Is there any talk of escalating the U.S. military presence on the ground?
There is, and it's significant. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth is reportedly weighing the deployment of an additional 10,000 ground troops to the region. That title, Secretary of War, comes from a 2025 executive order that renamed the Department of Defense. Those troops would supplement the 82nd Airborne Division and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, both of which are already in transit. The administration's argument is that this kind of decisive force is needed to secure places like Karg Island, which is Iran's main oil export hub, and to force a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's talk about that strait. How is the naval side of this war going?
Iran has effectively blocked the Strait of Hormuz, and the economic ripple effects are enormous. About 20% of global oil passes through that narrow waterway, so the blockade has pushed crude prices above $100 a barrel. Reopening it is a top priority, but it's extremely difficult when Iran can threaten shipping with mines, missiles, and fast attack boats from its own coastline. That's part of why the administration is talking about putting more boots on the ground nearby.
And this conflict has clearly spread well beyond just the U.S. and Iran. What's happening on the other fronts?
It really has become a regional war on multiple fronts. In Lebanon, Israel has intensified its ground invasion into the south, pushing toward the Litani River to dismantle Hezbollah's networks. That offensive has displaced roughly 1/5 of Lebanon's entire population, which is a staggering humanitarian toll. Then, in Yemen, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels launched a missile at Israel just today, March 28th, which was intercepted. But separate strikes in Tel Aviv have resulted in civilian casualties, so Israelis are feeling the pressure from multiple directions at once.
What about the situation inside Iran itself? There were reports early in the war about a leadership strike.
That's right. Early in the conflict, a U.S.-Israeli decapitation strike killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has reportedly taken control, but by most accounts, the government is fractured. There are internal protests alongside what analysts describe as a war of attrition against Iran's industrial and nuclear infrastructure. So Iran is fighting this war while dealing with a leadership transition and domestic unrest, which makes predictions about how long Tehran can sustain this incredibly difficult.
Back at Prince Sultan Air Base, what's the situation on the ground right now?
The base remains on high alert this morning. The Pentagon has already started shifting aircraft to other regional hubs to avoid having so many valuable assets concentrated in one place. That's a direct lesson from yesterday's attack. Commanders clearly don't want to give Iran another opportunity to take out multiple force multipliers in a single strike. Meanwhile, the White House has a 15-point ceasefire proposal on the table, but Tehran has rejected it so far.
1 month in, Ethan, what's the big takeaway from this conflict so far?
I think the big takeaway is that this war is exposing real vulnerabilities in American military planning. The interceptor crisis is the most urgent one. The U.S. built its regional defense posture around the assumption that it would always have enough missiles to stop incoming fire, and that assumption is being tested like never before. At the same time, Iran's ability to hit high-value targets with cheap drones and older missiles shows this isn't going to be a quick, clean air campaign. It's becoming a grinding, multi-front conflict with costs that are rising every single day.
Really important reporting, Ethan. Thank you for breaking all of that down for us.
Of course, Grace.
Our other big story this morning affects millions of Americans carrying student debt. The Department of Education is officially telling more than 7.5 million borrowers that their time on the Save Repayment plan is up. Chloe has been following this one closely. Chloe, what exactly happened here?
So yesterday, on March 27th, the Education Department started sending notices to everyone who'd been enrolled in the SAVE plan, which was the Biden administration's signature income-driven repayment program. The Associated Press and the Ridgefield Press both confirmed that this marks the definitive end of what was arguably the most generous student loan repayment option borrowers have ever had. We're talking about a program that let people pay as little as 5% of their discretionary income, and in many cases, nothing at all. That era is now officially over.
How did we get to this point? Because I remember this plan was tied up in courts for a long time.
It really was a long legal saga. Earlier this month, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit issued a final ruling that vacated the SAVE plan entirely. According to the Daily Democrat, that ruling finalized a settlement between the Trump administration and several states, led by Missouri, that had challenged the plan. Under Secretary of Education Nicholas Kent framed it as a return to, quote, financial discipline, end quote, and said, quote, the days of unlawful loan forgiveness are behind us, end quote. So the courts delivered the final blow, but Congress had already laid the groundwork.
You're talking about that big spending bill from last summer?
Exactly. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, signed into law on July 4, 2025. The Washington Post and CBS News both reported extensively on how that legislation fundamentally rewrote parts of the Higher Education Act. It stripped the Secretary of Education's authority to define discretionary income for repayment purposes, which was the entire mechanism that made plans like SAVE work. It also sunsetted other income-driven plans like PAYE and ICR, so even without the court ruling, these programs were on borrowed time, no pun intended.
So what's the timeline now for borrowers who've been in limbo?
The rollout is staggered, and borrowers need to pay close attention to when their notices arrive. According to the Akron News Reporter, the Education Department is sending these initial notifications in waves every 2 weeks, starting with people who were enrolled in the SAVE plan the longest. Then on July 1st, loan servicers will send formal notices giving borrowers a 90-day window to pick a new repayment plan. If you don't choose by the end of that window, you'll be automatically placed into either the standard 10-year plan or a new tiered standard plan that stretches 10 to 25 years depending on your balance.
And actual payments could start hitting bank accounts when?
The department expects monthly payments to resume as soon as this summer or early fall. That's a major jolt for people who've essentially been on pause. Borrowers have been in administrative forbearance since July 2024, so we're looking at more than 2 years without making a payment for many of them. That kind of gap makes the transition back to active repayment really daunting, especially when you factor in what's happened to their balances in the meantime.
What do you mean by that? Have balances changed while people were on pause?
They have, and not in borrowers' favor. Interest started accruing again in the summer of 2025 after a mid-litigation court ruling allowed it. So even though borrowers weren't required to make payments, their loans were growing. The Ridgefield Press notes that many people are going to log into their accounts and find their total balance is significantly higher than it was 2 years ago. That's part of what advocates are calling payment shock, or whiplash, this sudden collision between months of inactivity and a much larger bill.
Now there's a new plan, replacing SAVE. What does it look like?
It's called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP, and it launches July 1st. PBS and NerdWallet have both broken down the details, and it's a much stricter framework than what borrowers had before. Instead of calculating payments based on discretionary income, which excluded basic living costs, payments are now based on 1 to 10% of a borrower's total adjusted gross income. That's a fundamental shift in how the government determines what you can afford to pay.
Does that mean even people earning very little will owe something every month?
Yes, and that's one of the most controversial changes. Under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the $0 monthly payment option was abolished entirely. The new minimum is $10 a month, even for borrowers with no income or those earning less than $10,000 a year. That might sound small, but for someone truly struggling financially, it's a real burden. And it signals a philosophical shift away from the idea that the lowest earners should be shielded from payments altogether.
What about forgiveness? Can borrowers still eventually have their loans forgiven?
They can, but the timeline has gotten a lot longer. Under SAVE, depending on your loan amount, you could reach forgiveness in as little as 10 years. Under the RAP, it's a universal 30-year timeline, meaning 360 qualifying payments before any remaining balance is forgiven. To soften that a bit, the plan does include a principal payment match of up to $50 a month for borrowers whose payments are too low to actually chip away at their principal. It's a small concession, but it doesn't change the reality that borrowers are looking at decades longer on the hook.
And I understand there are changes coming to hardship protections too?
That's right, and this one hasn't gotten as much attention. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act eliminated economic hardship and unemployment deferments for all new loans disbursed after July 1, 2027. So current borrowers still have access to those safety nets for now, but future students won't. It's another sign that the overall policy direction is moving toward fewer off-ramps and more consistent collection, regardless of a borrower's financial circumstances.
There's also a big bureaucratic shift happening behind the scenes. The Treasury Department is taking over student loans.
This is a massive structural change that I think will have consequences for years. ABC News and the Washington Post report that the entire $1.7 trillion student loan portfolio is being transferred from the Department of Education to the Treasury Department. Phase 1 is already underway. Treasury has taken control of defaulted loans and the Default Resolution Group. Phase 2 kicks in this July, when Treasury assumes operational support for loans that aren't in default, including administering the RAP. Then late this year or into 2027, Treasury takes over the FAFSA and the broader student aid disbursement system.
What's the argument for doing that?
Proponents say it'll improve collection efficiency because Treasury can integrate repayment directly with tax filing data. The idea is that if the same agency handling your taxes also handles your loan payments, the process becomes more seamless and harder to fall through the cracks on. But advocacy groups like the Student Borrower Protection Center and Young Invincibles are raising alarms about what could go wrong during the transition. They're worried about transfer errors, lost records, and the dismantling of the Office of Federal Student Aid, which has specialized expertise in managing student loans that Treasury simply doesn't have yet.
How are borrowers themselves reacting to all of this?
Frustration and anxiety are the words I keep hearing. The Akron News reporter highlighted the story of Alexis Arredondo, a UCLA graduate who's now facing a choice between monthly payments she can't afford or committing to a 30-year repayment term that'll pile on massive interest. Mike Pierce of the Student Borrower Protection Center told NPR that borrowers are being, quote, stripped of affordable options, end quote, during what he called an ongoing affordability crisis. Meanwhile, the administration maintains that the, quote, era of mass student loan forgiveness, end quote, is officially over, and that these changes restore accountability to the system.
Is there anything borrowers should be doing right now while they wait for their formal notices?
Absolutely. The number one thing is to log into studentaid.gov and make sure your contact information is current, because if those notices go to an old address or email, you could miss your window and end up automatically enrolled in a plan you didn't choose. The site also has an updated loan simulator tool that lets you compare what your monthly costs would look like under the RAP versus the tiered standard plan. Given the stakes here, spending 30 minutes running those numbers now could save borrowers a lot of grief down the road.
Really important information for millions of people. Chloe, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Of course, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Starting with a bite of technology news, the Trump administration is pushing for a singular artificial intelligence framework. To keep the gears of progress from grinding, officials are trying to stitch together a federal plan that would unravel the current patchwork of state regulations. This light-touch approach would effectively delete state laws that place an undue burden on developers. It follows a December 2025 executive order that used an AI litigation task force to download pressure onto states, even threatening to unplug federal broadband funding for those with onerous rules. In a legislative counter-program, 6 Democratic senators led by Brian Schatz have uploaded the Guardrails Act to hit the undo button on the order and save state-level safeguards in places like California and Colorado. Moving to the friendly skies, President Trump signed an executive memorandum to ensure 60,000 Transportation Security Administration employees are paid, flying right past a 42-day funding stalemate in Congress. Calling the air travel crisis an emergency, the president is rerouting existing funds to mitigate staffing shortages where worker callouts have soared to 40%. While Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin says workers can expect to see green by Monday, March 30, 2026, the rest of the department remains in a holding pattern as House Republicans rejected a Senate funding bill before taking a 2-week vacation. In Nepal, the political rhythm is changing as police arrested former Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli and former Home Minister Ramesh Lekak, following a report into the deaths of 76 people during the Gen Z protests. The new government, led by rapper-turned-politician Balendra Shah, is looking to set a new record for accountability. Current Home Minister Sudan Gurung noted that this is the intro to justice, with recommendations for 10-year sentences for those who ordered police to fire on protesters in September 2025. While the opposition calls it a vindictive remix, the new administration is sticking to its campaign lyrics of holding former leaders to a higher standard. Over in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is making sure minors do not get lost in the feed by enforcing a nationwide ban on social media for anyone under 16. This digital diet affects 70 million children across platforms like TikTok and Instagram to protect them from algorithmic giants. Platform X has already updated its settings to make sure users are old enough to handle the scroll, as the nation tries to pull the plug on what officials have termed a digital emergency. Finally, Utah Governor Spencer Cox signed House Bill 89, prohibiting authorities from asking sexual assault victims to take a polygraph test. This ensures a victim's refusal to sit in the hot seat for a lie detector won't stall their case. After an investigation showed that trauma can trip up the sensors and lead to false readings, the state decided to stop testing the limits of survivors. The law goes into effect May 6, 2026, making Utah the latest of nearly 25 states to realize that these tests are far from the whole truth. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.